Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our first of its kind live expert panel discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Aaron Provencio, and I am a member of the communications team here at Galapagos Conservancy. And joining me today is Dr. James Gibbs, our resident giant tortoise expert. So, Dr. Gibbs, before we get started, would you mind telling our viewers a little bit more about who you are, what you've been involved in, and how long you've been working with Galapagos Conservancy.
Thank you, Aaron, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted you all could join. As Aaron mentioned, my name is James Gibbs. I am the Vice President of Science and Conservation at the Galapagos Conservancy, a position I was recently appointed to, but I've been involved with GC and all the good work it does for about 8 years, previously as adjunct scientist. But I have been working in Galapagos for about 40 years now, 30 of those with the crew, Wacho Tapia and others, especially on focusing on giant tortoises. And when I'm not working with GC folks pushing science and conservation ahead, I am a professor at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where I teach courses in conservation, biology, and herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians.
So, a little bit of everything. And speaking of herpetology, science of reptiles and amphibians, that is, of course, what we are here to talk about today. Because, as I'm sure a lot of you viewers at home know, Galapagos is known for its endemic giant tortoise species, which are a subject of conservation issue and conservation importance, both within the Galapagos Conservancy, but with conservation professionals and scientists around the world. To give you a little bit of context on Galapagos itself, the archipelago is located 600 miles west of mainland Ecuador, and the story goes that it was actually named originally on a map by a Flemish cartographer who named the island after the tortoises themselves because of the saddle shape of their shell. The word Galapagos comes from the word for saddle, or so the story goes. So naturally, the Galapagos tortoises have taken on a significant amount of importance as icons of conservation for Galapagos, for world scientists and environmentalists all across the globe. I should mention before we go any farther, those of you tuning in, if you have any questions or comments during this live discussion for myself or more likely for Dr. Gibbs, please go ahead and put those into the comments below. We have somebody who will be moderating that chat, answering as many questions as possible, and if necessary, passing those along to us so that we can answer them here as we're discussing. But moving forward a little bit, today we are talking about some really exciting research that you just published in your most recent publication with collaborators about the Santa Fe Island Tortoise Project. So, if there are those who are tuning in who might not have been watching our social media over the past week or so, can you give us a little bit of rundown about what is Santa Fe Island like? I'll put up a map of kind of where it is in the archipelago while you speak, but give us an idea of what it's like on Santa Fe Island, the ecology, the wildlife, and then what the project ultimately was focused on.
So Santa Fe Island is an absolute gem within Galapagos, which is a gem unto itself. It's a small island. It's only about 10 square miles in total, but it's a very low island. It's as you can see on the map, just to the southeast of Santa Cruz, so right in the center of the archipelago. It has very distinct ridges running east to west. It's a sort of mix of deciduous forest, shrubs and small trees, but lots of open areas. And 2 months of the year when it rains, it bursts forth in grasses and herbaceous plants that quickly die back. But I think what makes it really special is the 250,000 arboreal cacti that occur on the island, and these are massive. These are the Opuntia cacti that those of you who've been to Galapagos are familiar with, but it's a genus common everywhere. But here on Santa Fe, they reach the highest, the tallest that they get 15 feet at times, but there's the fact that there's a 250,000 of them makes it a truly remarkable island among Galapagos. So I need to mention two other facts about Hispaniola, though. About Santa Fe, though. It is the home to two other, endemic species, as well as a significant population of a third. But we have the pallid iguana, is a large land iguana, lizard that really only occurs on the entire planet on this one island. There's an endemic species of gecko, another small reptile that very few people get to see, but there's also the rice rat that used to be found, various species of them throughout the archipelago, but it is also holding on Santa Fe, where it is really quite abundant, and it's wonderful to see rice, the native rat, which is quite a charming animal in its native habitat and in its normal numbers. But so for a small island, it's got an awful lot, and it's biologically speaking, but it's also just a beautiful island aesthetically speaking, with these great landscapes and these forests of giant cacti. So,
Thank you so much for describing it. And then, James, we are getting a little notification from our comment moderator. Would you be willing to speak a little bit into the microphone a little bit more? Some of us are having a little bit of difficult hearing, but it's perfect because all this information, of course, is super critical. We want to learn as much as we can while we have you here. So, would you mind kind of going through and describing the Santa Fe project itself and what that sort of looked like?
yes, so I hope my audio is a little bit better there. Okay, great. Yeah, the Santa Fe project is both an important one for Galapagos, but also it has some global implications, and I'll explain why as we move through this. Global implications for conservation practice. But the short story for this island is that it, being a small island and a very accessible one, it was one of the first that, for example, whalers and others visited, removed all the tortoises from, and it had an enormous infestation of goats for an extended period of time. In fact, one of the highest densities of goats observed in Galapagos. That combination of losing these large reptiles, which we will talk about in their roles and what they do in the environment, but especially this incursion of goats, really has wreaked a lot of havoc upon the island. So the goats were removed in the 1970s, the first island in Galapagos where they were successfully removed, and many of the techniques we use today were first used. But those goats, they eat everything, and that's not everything that is photosynthetic. So it's not a complete exaggeration. I mean, they will eventually take down trees and cacti, but certainly all of the herbaceous vegetation and grasses. And so we do have people still active that were present in the early 1970s when the peak of this destruction was occurring. And you can read and talk to people like Ole Hammen, the Danish botanist, and Chitte de Vries, and about the state of the island. Ole Hammen writes about the tremendous erosion on this barren island, and really sort of getting pushed to the point of collapse. So goats removed by the National Park Service created this opportunity, at least to take the biggest threat out. And the island then began to heal, but extraordinarily slowly. It's interesting, even 10 years after the removal of the goats, there was very little vegetation recovery. And so what does vegetation need? Vegetation, of course, is the basis for the entire ecosystem in the terrestrial ecosystem. All of the birds and the mammals and the other lizards and such, that vegetation has essentially appeared to be largely stalled. They're recovering ever so slowly. But this is where we get into giant tortoises. There's incontrovertible evidence that tortoises once occurred on this island. Their physical remains, from which DNA has been extracted by the genetics group at Yale University, that identify a distinct species present on the island. So these are these major shapers of ecosystems, and plant communities work in a sense with animal communities. Not all of them, but especially with herbivores. Herbivores have mixed impacts. They both eat vegetation and can push plants back, but they also disperse a huge number of seeds and digest vegetative material and make it available, all the nutrients for other plants. And so tortoises are sort of like a big agent in. They're more important than other species, and so this is a critical. Every species matters, of course, but some, dare I say, in an ecological sense, matter more than others. And so this is a loss of giant tortoises and all the things they do in these ecosystems is very, very significant. So the idea was to bring back this. We can talk in more detail about what tortoises do, but very creative, in sort of and supportive of ecosystem processes and all the things they do. And so the idea is we need to help hasten the ecosystem recovery, which is still ongoing. We need all the pieces back again, and hence the desire and decision to bring back giant tortoises to Santa Fe, where they had been absent for 200 to 300 years, but to bring them back and let them do the work that they do in these ecosystems.
And speaking of the work that they do, what you were describing and the language that is used in your paper is ecosystem engineer. And if those of you viewing at home have been paying attention to our Facebook or our Instagram or any of our social medias, we have been using the term ecosystem engineer all week. And to an ecosystem engineer has various definitions, but it's essentially, as James described it, it's an animal, an organism that creates, significantly modifies, maintains, or destroys a habitat in a way that is disproportionate to other species in that ecosystem. As James mentioned, the tortoises play that role, not just on Santa Fe, but on other islands within Galapagos. And the loss of those tortoises from this island has had negative impacts and implications on the native habitat. Would you mind kind of going a little bit more in detail to what those sort of ecosystem engineer duties that a tortoise plays look like?
Yes, so this ecosystem engineer, it's a bit of jargon. Scientists like jargon, but this one's actually pretty useful. I think the term was actually developed for use with applied to beavers, and it's mainly, if you're familiar with it, that one little rodent that builds a dam and creates, engineers a habitat for hundreds of other species, everything from, so that is the general concept. And so it applies here to these very large reptiles. So these, we actually weighed one giant tortoise or recently that was over 800 pounds. But just to give you a sense of these, and they can achieve very high densities of several per acre, or more than that. But just to give you a sense, so we have large herbivorous reptiles. Basically, no large mammals ever managed to make it to Galapagos to colonize. The niche probably would have been filled with the same ungulates that we see around the world, but tortoises are it in Galapagos, plus the land iguanas that, and they do, we don't actually know, but they eat hundreds and hundreds of pounds of vegetation every year. They eat vast numbers of seeds and fruits and flowers. They repackage that in a nutrient-rich package and move it around the landscape. And deposit it, sort of plant it. They're sort of gardeners, if you will. And they are, you just can't have animals of this size and this density that are really not going to be shaping this ecosystem in very significant ways. And as far as we can tell, they generally seem to maintain these open savanna-like habitats in ecosystems in the Galapagos, mixes of grasses and woody plants. And when you remove the tortoises, the grasses tend to not be able to compete as well, and the woody plants tend to take over. And that's the general pattern, but they're doing all kinds of things for lots of different species, both directly dispersing the plants. The cacti are very dependent, but then secondarily, all the species that depend on those plants. So that's the concept and in practice with this particular group in Galapagos.
And I would be remiss if we didn't mention, we'll island hop a little bit over to Española, which we, Galapagos Conservancy, alongside our collaborators, recently did an expedition out there to also monitor tortoise populations and the ecological effects that those restored populations are having on the habitat around them. And just as James was mentioning about those large reptiles in Galapagos, which actually one is lurking over his right shoulder right now for those of you that are viewing at home. Um, they have a really interesting impact on the native flora and fauna in the area. One of which is Galapagos, the Galapagos, the waved albatross, which spend a lot of their life, most of the time of the year, flying all over the place, but every will come back and nest and breed on Galapagos, one of which islands is Española, in these massive colonies. But one of the weird kind of unique things about Galapagos, about the albatross, I keep saying Galapagos, about the waved albatross, is that they lay eggs just right on the ground. They need bare dirt or bare rocks in which to nest and rear their young. But when you have a large ecosystem engineer no longer present in the same numbers as they used to, as you mentioned, those woody plants do tend to creep in a little bit. And so we actually have a GIF here from um, that just demonstrates when those tortoises are allowed to kind of roam free on those islands, just how far they transition and move. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up on the screen right now. This is from another study that, again, is not on Santa Fe, this is Española, but for those of you viewing at home, those individual dots of color are individual marked tortoises that are being tracked over a significant amount of time. If you look up at the top there, you can see the let me restart that. You can see the kind of colors that they're moving around and stuff. So these tortoises move a significant distance, and in doing so, they move down towards where the albatross are nesting, kind of move those plants out of the way, eats and use their bulk to knock over woody plants and essentially open back nesting sites. So different tortoises do different services on different islands, but again, getting back to Santa Fe Island, the the interesting aspect of, I think, this project, and you kind of alluded to it earlier in terms of the conservation implications that are potentially coming out based on this groundbreaking research, is that the tortoises that were introduced to Santa Fe are not technically native to the island. They're not technically residents of the island. Can you explain that a little bit more for the viewers at home, please?
Yeah, this is an important uh, dimension to this effort to restore Santa Fe, which is that, you know, in this case, the tortoises are extinct. There's little hope anybody has of ever finding any extant ones anywhere. What do you do? Where do you go? And uh, it's a complicated question because, ethically and in terms of policy, we don't want to be moving species to areas where they're not native. But in this case, we need this agent back in the ecosystem. And so this is a very hot topic these days in conservation, which is it's called trophic rewilding, but it's bringing back forms of perhaps native species, but in some cases, if they aren't available, similar but non-native species to an area to help this restoration process. So that's exactly the problem that was faced with, the park was faced with on Santa Fe was, okay, need tortoises back here. What do you do? And fortunately, giant tortoises, there's a large mix of species, but they do form groups around the archipelago of genetically related. So the tortoises of Española Island, San Cristobal, one part of Santa Cruz and Santa Fe Island formed one genetic group. They seem to have similar kind of shapes. And among those, the Española tortoises they're very genetically very closely related. We don't actually have an intact Santa Fe tortoise anywhere, so we can't say they look the same. But operationally speaking, and this is an important consideration as well, is that the Española tortoises have been seemingly successfully restored to their island on the brink of extinction at 15, now up to several thousand. They were in captivity, those last ones, and those founders that you just watched move around the island in the GIF that Aaron shared. But though the decision was, well, they're already in captivity, why don't we just then start releasing their offspring to this other island that needs, and the tortoise is genetically appropriate, and we think, but we don't know, is morphologically appropriate. And that's what was done. So this is sort of, this is where it gets somewhat novel and somewhat, cutting edge in terms of conservation is using a non-native but a similar analog species to help the restoration process, but moving a non-native species into an island. So the remarkable thing that we never anticipated. So this project was actually ended 5 years early because of its success. And I say the remarkable thing that we never anticipated was how well these tortoises would do. So one of the great predictions was they're not native, they're not going to be well adapted to this ecosystem. They've had 98% survival. They've had as strong or stronger, slightly stronger growth on this island as they had on their home island of Hispaniola. They're just doing extraordinarily well, and we've captured, them over 2,000 times the 700 that have been released. But we measure them regularly, and they're just doing extremely well. So so much so that they're growing faster. They're gonna begin breeding themselves. These are mostly smaller tortoises. But that was a big surprise in all of this. We thought that they would be somehow less adapted, less able, but they're doing just as well, if not better, than they did on their native island.
Yeah, I think it's if anybody knows conservation, the being able to cut a 10-year program off 5 years early because everything is going very well is a pretty incredible success story that I think again makes this already unique program, this already unique project, so much more unique and so much more novel. To give a little bit of context about the slotting in of a non-native species into an existing species space, a niche is what that's often referred to, or niche, depending on how you were how you were raised to say it. It's essentially, if we think about the island of Santa Fe as a car engine, and all of a sudden you decide to take the clutch out for some reason, that engine's not going to function very well, if at all. But if you go to the store and buy another clutch and put it back in, that might just function essentially as well as it could have before you took the clutch out in the first place. And despite the, what was it that you said, 200, 300-year gap between tortoise populations on Santa Fe, that engine seems to be running pretty well again. Post eradication of these feral goats that you mentioned earlier, Santa Fe's ecosystem was healing, but again, as you said, it wasn't healing in the way that scientists and conservationists within GC and other groups were hoping that it would, which is where the decision to bring in some help essentially came from. You sort of already spoke about the ultimate goal of reintroducing the engineers, but when this program started, what were you hoping to be saying 5 years down the road where we are right now?
Yeah, we didn't really expect to be this far ahead, just because we expected the young tortoises released would struggle, but eventually find their home ranges and get. But we also didn't quite expect sort of the positive effects that we're seeing. So fortunately, the National Park Service and Galapagos Conservancy invested very heavily, not just in this introduction, but also it's technically a conservation introduction, but also in monitoring how they're doing and what their impacts are. This is all predicated on doing good things for the island. So we've had an intensive program of surveying the pallet iguana population, the cactus population, the vegetation, and actually all of the other wildlife. But what we've realized is that tortoises have been put into this system at a point where it's still in a very long-term recovery. Since we began this process, the land iguana population has actually increased. The cactus population also increased. Do we think tortoises help them? Not particularly. We think that they may in the future, but clearly this island is still in a long-term steady recovery from the 1970s. So we have all manner of systems out there trying to keep track of things, because there potentially are risks in these conservation introductions. So but we're seeing very important early impacts on things like cactus. We're starting to see a hint that the tortoises, when we've built these large exclosures, chain-linked exclosures, and Aaron may have a picture of that to show you, but we to basically to test. They're very small, but they exclude tortoises and iguanas from different areas, and then we can measure the change in the vegetation inside and out. And they're actually having some very significant early impacts on, especially the cactus population, dispersing more of the seeds and the fruits away from where they would be otherwise depredated by the birds at the base of the cacti. They seem to be more woody plants growing inside these exposures than, which is what we would have predicted, than outside where the tortoises and iguanas still can access things. So the changes aren't radical, they aren't dramatic, but they're observable, and they're significant in a statistical sense and increasing in a biological sense. So I think we're seeing a recovering island with now tortoises added that are going to help further facilitate it. But we will see. We hope to continuing this monitoring maybe on a 5-year basis long into the future to make sure that everything is going as planned.
Yeah, so I have the number right here. As you mentioned, it was a 5 year study from 2015 to 2020. And I have that you introduced, at least at the time of the paper, 582. Is that correct?
Correct. And there were just another cohort dropped in, and that was the last one after that publication. So
Okay.
yes,
So
it's about 700.
Okay, wow. So there's a lot of little tortoises out there doing their jobs. And these are not the full size, as we're looking over your right shoulder. They're not the big guys just yet, right? They're still growing.
Correct. So these are the little guys, as you said, although as I say, they're growing, and they're growing fast enough that they're hard to recognize. You get to know them individually, even though there's a lot of them, that even the little guys that were released 5 years ago are growing pretty substantially. So most of them are these 5-year-old hatchlings that's an Espanola tortoise behind in the screenshot here. But we also did transfer 31 subadults from Espanola Island, had a good period of quarantine to ensure they weren't moving any seeds or parasites between islands, and then they were added as well. So they should begin breeding perhaps this year. But even some of the little ones, which would now be 5-year-olds, the first ones would now be 10-year-olds, they're showing signs of courting each other and chasing each other around and being interested in mating. So they're not long off either. There's abundant nesting habitat, enormous expanses of nesting habitat for tortoises, for iguanas on the island. So we don't anticipate any limitations, but they have yet to breed. But I'm quite certain that they will this year or next.
And as you said before, I want to reiterate this point is that the ecological scale of change takes a while. We as people really wish that we could sit there and look weekly, monthly, and be like, oh look, it's improving, it's significantly different, we're on 100% right about this work that we're doing, and we can do it everywhere else. When in reality, that's just not the case. Nature works at its very own pace, and no matter how much we're sitting here rooting it on, the ultimate results of this study are still years and years down the road. If you had to take a wild guess, when do you think that these perceived optimistic signs could really turn into really truly beneficial results for the Santa Fe ecosystem?
That's a great question, Aaron, and that's one thing I've learned. We've learned all learning about Galapagos is that some of these changes that we seek, they are going to take a long time, especially whole ecosystems to recover. And in Galapagos, one of the issues is that we have, for the arid parts, which is most of the archipelago, they just, they're actually, have photosynthetic activity for maybe 2 months a year. It's, they're otherwise, for the most part, the plant community shut down. We do, though, get these episodic El Nino events where just huge amounts of rainfall. Most years in Galapagos, it's 2 centimeters. El Nino, it's 3 meters. We think that those El Nino events really may be the things that really push the ecosystem. But at this point, the ecosystem is changing. It seems to be changing in a positive trajectory in terms of these key species that we hope would increase in numbers are. But I haven't done the actual extrapolation, but I would, fully expect seeing the change that we've seen from 1970 to the present, there's 50 years has been substantial, but not dramatic. That I think we're looking at another 100, 150 years to get all these pieces working well. The good news is that the key elements to this seem now to be kind of self-sustaining. The tortoises, they're still only on 10% of the island. They're still, they're not breeding yet. They're still small, but they seem to now be able to, sustain themselves. And so this is the goal here is not actually to recover things from 0 to 100%, but it's to get all the pieces working together and sustaining themselves so that we can kind of step out of the picture and let them take it from there. And that's been the goal here. And for many of the islands in Galapagos, including Hispaniola, you mentioned, is all the pieces are there. They seem to be fairly secure, but now we just have to give them time to do their work and recover these ecosystems. But it's at least 100 years more.
And you've had quite a long and illustrious career working with tortoises, but this project might just outlive that career, huh? So we're hoping that some plucky young scientist 150 years down the road can come back and open up this paper and say, you know what, Dr. James, it worked. It worked. We did it.
Well, absolutely. That's yes. Wonderful. When I was a youngster starting off in Galapagos, I used to read the works of these older scientists who I hope to someday be, and here I am. And exactly, this is a work of generations. It's a collective work of many, and it will take time. But that's the great excitement of in Galapagos is that these things are happening. People are pulling together, and they are making these investments for this long-term success. It will take a while, but it's definitely a very positive horizon.
And speaking of those that coming together, that investment, those of you who are viewing at home, it's really, it comes down to the support and the investment that you all, our supporters, our followers, give to help us complete this essential work. The Galapagos Conservancy is a true boots on the ground organization that is involved in all sorts of different projects such as this all across the archipelago. Before this program started, Dr. Gibbs and I were discussing another project that we've been working on involving the pink land iguanas up on Wolf Volcano. So we have our hands in a lot of cookie jars, and we're doing as much as we can to stay involved in the conservation of this incredible archipelago, but ultimately we need your help. I know that our comment moderator put a link down in the comments of this Facebook to visit our website, galapagos.org, to learn more about our projects, to learn more about how you can get involved, become a member, get on our email list, follow our social medias. If this stuff interests you, please get involved and get connected with us here at GC, because like myself, like Dr. Gibbs, we're a group of really, really dedicated individuals who alongside yourself, the viewers, our supporters, want to do all that we can to save this incredible natural treasure, which is Galapagos Archipelago. And that being said, I know that we do have a few questions from the comments chat. So Dr. Gibbs, if I could keep you around for just a little bit longer, we'll go ahead and work through some of these. So this one is from Sebastian Zurita. How do invasive species affect giant tortoises? That's a big question.
Yes, but a good question, an important one, because they do affect giant tortoises in a variety of ways. Let's take the case of invasive plants. We have in Galapagos the case of the invasive raspberry mora and lantana. These actually are plants that are moving in, and they're actually creating physical barriers to the tortoises. And this causes problems because tortoises are actually quite migratory in some populations. All populations, they move a lot, but some, and so that's just one example. Tortoises, interestingly, may actually exacerbate the situation because they like some of these fruits of these invasive species and tend to move them and disperse them. We do have, of course, historically, enormous problems with rats eating hatchlings and pretty much eliminating reproduction in some populations. Goats have been an enormous problem just through what we've just been discussing here by just basically destroying habitat. And there are some other trickier ones that maybe people don't appreciate, but things like fire ants and others will actually actually attack the skin of giant tortoises and some of their more vulnerable parts, and actually ultimately end up causing them some real physical problems and actually tail amputations and things. So those are really, but they also directly attack hatchlings. So there's a whole lot of invasive species issues affecting these animals directly or indirectly through their habitat. And so tortoise conservation is as much about habitat restoration, invasive species control, eradication, removal, as captive rearing and such.
Invasive species is definitely one. It's a very pervasive problem that Galapagos as an entire archipelago, the Ecuadorian government, combats every single day. It's a significant problem both on the archipelago but around the world, and it's something that conservationists and scientists are working to combat daily. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. That's a great question. Thank you, Sebastian. You spoke a little bit about the goats right there, Dr. Gibbs, from Barbara Hayes. What happened in the 70s that was such a disruption to the islands?
Yes. Well, in the 1970s was the point of the first goat eradication, which was performed on Santa Fe. In retrospect, it seems easy, go out and remove the goats, but at that point, nobody really knew how to do it, what it involved, how to go about it. And so that was and the fact that Santa Fe, it was both small and a good place to start, but also was in apparent, such apparent destructed state because of the goats. That was the decision was made to go there then. So the goats had probably been introduced in the 1800s, and had been there, numbers building up. But in the early 1970s, the decision was made to remove them. So that was the big change, was to remove this hundreds of year-long plague of goats, and then let the ecosystem begin the slow process of healing.
So to reiterate, essentially, there was the decision to begin the ecosystem restoration project. That the Santa Fe tortoise program that we're talking about right now, is the continuation of. It's the removal of those non-native feral goats, which are impacting the vegetation and landscape so significantly, and then eventually in 2015 reintroducing the natural ecosystem engineer, the proxy natural ecosystem engineer, in their stead, which is I think another part of this program that's just super unique, is that we're watching this ecosystem restoration in real time. Um, all right, from Scott Thompson. This is a long one, so bear with me here. That you're seeing increased size from Espanola tortoises living on Santa Fe. Could this be indicative of environmental impacts on the differences between taxonomies, since there is very little between them in comparison to other species? I guess, is there anything that you think is happening? If I guess I'm going to attempt to synthesize this question. Hopefully, I'm doing you right, Scott. But is there any sort of difference on the ecological aspects of Santa Fe versus Espanola that gives these two tortoises different sizes or anything like that?
Yeah, no, I think so. Interestingly, the two islands are remarkably similar in terms of their plant communities, their their size, their shape, their elevation, and such. But there's one big difference, and it's the number of cacti. And we've always puzzled why this difference occurs. But Espanola has very few cacti, and Santa Fe Island has this 250,000 present. And we think the difference is the land iguanas that were never on Espanola, but have managed to hang on, this endemic species on Espanola, on Santa Fe Island, I'm sorry, and the pallet iguana, where they continue. They're also very good dispersers of cactus seeds. And also, we increasingly realizing it's the native rat, which is, we just find vast caches of cactus seeds that these little rats have packed here and there. They eat some of them, they forget where others of them are. Really think those are the differences between these two islands. So, but to get back to your question, I think it is the cactus that is so abundant on Santa Fe that these Espanola tortoises have, I think, really benefited from. And I think that's a key factor here. We know tortoise love cacti, pads, flowers, fruits, and the sheer abundance of them on Santa Fe, I think, has given them this boost to their growth and their very high survival. And I think that's what's going on.
One aspect of the paper that when I read your paper that I thought was really interesting was that I believe the word was cladodes, which is essentially is that the pad of the cactus?
Yes.
Yes. So the cladodes that were on the ground were being consumed at a much higher rate when the tortoises were around, which was eliminating density issues with the cacti. Because if those of you have succulents that you're growing in as house plants, you can pull a leaf off and plant it in the ground and it'll propagate. So when those pads, those cladodes drop off and hit the ground, they can potentially start growing there. But these tortoises are just hoovering up those pads. Is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Without tortoises and without iguanas, but without tortoises, you know, the cladodes, the leaves, just fall underneath the adult. Some of them get rooted, but most of them can't even get started. They're shaded by the adult. They're competing for water. They don't make it. The seeds and the fruits fall to the ground, and the birds all know where to go to get them, and they go and they crack all the seeds and they destroy them. So you've got a little bit of vegetative reproduction, as you mentioned, the cladodes, but very little of it, and you don't really have any of the sexual reproduction, which is seeds. You bring in tortoises, they go in and they clean out all of this, all of the fallen pads, and which would be the vegetative reproduction. But they're picking up huge numbers of these seeds and depositing them, a kilometer away, way away from where birds can find them in these moist little packages, and like little greenhouses, really. And we're just seeing, since tortoises have been introduced in different areas, huge increases in small cacti. So that's the difference. In some ways, yeah, they're eating a lot of the pads, and you could say they're bad for the cactus. But most of these pads are never going to survive under the adults, anyways. That seems to be why we even have flowers and seeds, was to get offspring away, in terms of evolution, away from parents, But the tortoises basically are that agent, as are the iguanas in moving them out where they can actually survive, and they get as a reward that wonderful fruit to eat.
Of
So
course, there's just another example of why these tortoises are so essential. Just those little nutrient-packed little envelopes of seeds and other things that tortoises are so conveniently dropping all across the island. I'll let you figure out what Dr. Gibbs is talking about there. All right, I think this is a great question to end up on. This might be the hardest question you've been asked yet today, Dr. Gibbs. So I'll see what your answer is from this. So this one is from Andrea Batista. Does Dr. Gibbs have a favorite individual tortoise that especially captured his heart?
oh goodness. I am intrigued with these little ones running around chasing each other as 9-year-olds. Um, but I think all of us are pretty impressed with Diego, who is one of the 3 males of the Espanola species, the 15 that survived, that both beget all of the tortoises on Espanola, the 3,000, but also this whole group now on Santa Fe. And Diego is a magnificent tortoise taken off Espanola in 1930, and brought back to Galapagos in the 1970s and released back home to Espanola last year. And we've been tracking him on, I don't know how old he is. You can do the math. He was an adult in 1930 probably, and he's doing wonderfully on the island, moving around. We follow his little satellite tag. So I think of all of them, he's all kind of beaten up and broken his shell and scratched, but he's still as spry and tough personality as ever. He's a real inspiration for a lot of us in terms of the long term. It's going to take a while. You got to push, but Diego would be a great favorite of ours, of many people, mine included, in terms of his inspiration he provides for us to.
Okay, and unfortunately for everybody, the last question does have to come to me because I think one of the most significant aspects of this project, and we kind of already glanced on it, was the potential impacts that this type of reintroduction of a non-native but very similar species to an ecosystem can have. So ultimately, Dr. Gibbs, what do you think is the significance that this project and the perceived success that it's been having so far can have for global conservation projects?
Yeah. It's interesting. This is an implementation of really what's still a radical idea that people are having about, using species, moving non-native species to areas where they can have a constructive benefit. And you'll hear this written about, but there's very little of this actually being done. And so we're kind of excited. Our focus has been on this island, and it seems to be going very well. It's also proof of concept that this could be done on other islands. So there's other islands in Galapagos without tortoises, like Pinta Island, that perhaps a non-native species um, or one with some of the remnants of the genome that we're finding in hybrids could also do pretty well on. But I guess more significantly, and this was not intended to be global scale conservation, but it's a proof of concept for others that this can actually work. Tortoises may be easier to work than maybe bringing in other sorts of ungulates, mammals to do this kind of work in other island systems or other continents, but it has worked remarkably well in Galapagos in every sense. The well-being of the animals themselves, their in positive initial contributions. So I think that's the primary contribution into a much discussed concept, trophic rewilding in the conservation community today, bringing back whole ecosystems through bringing in these ecosystem engineers that may or may not be native. But here we've actually, it's all the work of the National Park Service and other groups, Galapagos Conservancy, but the tortoises themselves, it seems to have worked, and it may well work in other areas. There's a proof of concept.
I don't know if there's perhaps any better way to end off this live stream. So, Dr. Gibbs, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your insight and expertise about tortoises and giving us a behind-the-scenes look of the Santa Fe Tortoise Project. I know personally I had a great time. I hope those of you viewing at home enjoyed as well. If you're interested in learning more about Galapagos Conservancy and our essential work for Galapagos Archipelago, please visit galapagos.org. There you can get involved, become a supporter, symbolically adopt species. If this in any way interests you or engages you, we need your help. So please join us in our fight to save Galapagos Archipelago. Again, Dr. Gibbs, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will go ahead and sign off there. So thank you so much, everybody. Bye, Dr. Gibbs.
Thank you.